I'm the dad of 4 kiddos. And one of the things, many things I've learned over the years from them, but one of the things I've really centered in on is that if my kid comes home or they come into the other room and they start repeating the same word over and over and over, they're probably kind of excited about it. They want me to somewhat pay attention to it. I mean, it's like my youngest not too long ago, he came home and he was talking about his new school and his new playground. And he was like, Dad, I was out on the playground at recess and I went down the slide and then I went over and got my buddy and we went down the slide and I went back up the slide and I went down the slide. And so I was like, so you kind of like the slide. Like that's kind of, I can kind of get the point because he repeats it over and over and over. And the Bible is the same way. If in a small amount of space, the Bible repeats a word over and over and over, you might want to pay attention to it because that might be the key point of the text. In Daniel chapter 3, the first 15 verses, the word worship in English is repeated 9 times. 9 times, just over and over and over. It's like worship, 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 worship. So the point of Daniel 3 might have something to do with worship. When we dive right into the first verse, King Nebuchadnezzar, coming fresh off of this vision in Daniel 2 of this giant statue with the head of gold. Chapter 3, verse 1 says King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high, that's about 90 feet high, and 6 cubits wide, 9 feet wide. He makes this enormous image, probably based off of his dream. And then he decides to attach the image to worship. He sends out a decree that everyone is to worship this image. And if they don't, verse 6 tells us what happens. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. You see, in the first 15 verses, worship is repeated 9 times. Why? Because in the book of Daniel, worship is war. Let me say that again. In the book of Daniel, worship is war. It's where the battle is fought. It's where the enemy is targeting. It's what God expects for him. Because when we worship, we are pledging allegiance. When we worship, we are claiming an identity. When we worship, we are transforming into someone else. Worship is war. And Nebuchadnezzar at the beginning of chapter 3 draws the battle lines. It's wartime. And worship is the center of it. You see, in the ancient world, worship was a parasitic relationship. This mutually parasitic relationship where, you give me something that I want, and then I'll give you something that you want. All of the ancient deities, they had this bloodlust for sacrifice. If you give me sacrifices, then I will give you power, because that's what all the kings and all of the kingdoms were desiring. In the ancient world, you would have the deities that you're worshiping, the gods that are worshiping, that were latched onto you and demanding something from you, and you were doing the same. You were latched on to the deity. You were worshiping the deity because you were expecting something in return. Nebuchadnezzar is desiring power, prominence, and he's using his authority to get it. And the center of how he accomplishes all of this is through worship. And worship is something that the Israelites had struggled with for quite some time. Even though it was the first commandment in Exodus 20, that you shall have no other gods before me, that you worship me alone, because worship defines who you are. The nation of Israel struggled, compromising in their worship of other gods. And so at this moment, when Nebuchadnezzar puts up this statue, It wouldn't have been ridiculous for the nation of Israel to act like the way they have been acting, but the problem is that their bad worship practices led them into exile to begin with. And what we find is in Daniel chapter 3, verse 12, Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are willing to go to war over who they worship. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 12, it says this: "There are some Jews," this is what the chief priests are tattling to Nebuchadnezzar about. "There are some Jews whom you have set up over the affairs of the province of Babylon, O king, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. You have given them things, but they are not giving you worship in return. They are not agreeing to this parasitic relationship, and their worship reveals their true allegiance. Their worship reveals their true identity, because in the ancient world, in the book of Daniel, worship is war. And when Nebuchadnezzar heard that these three officials were defying his decree, he lost his mind. He became enraged, and he brings Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into his presence to confront them. He comes after them and he says, "You either worship this statue or I will throw you into the fiery furnace." Here's the problem at this point. If you know how the story goes, you might miss the point. See, yes, as the story goes, they end up saying, "We're not going to worship your statue." And Nebuchadnezzar gets really ticked, and he takes the furnace and makes it up really hot so that even when the people are trying to throw in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they die. And then whenever the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the fiery furnace, a fourth person appears, and Nebuchadnezzar's like, "Oh my goodness, they're walking around and they've not been hurt," and they come out unfazed. They come out unsinged. If you know how the story ends, you actually might miss the point of the story. Because the point of the story has very little to do with the rescue. The point of the fiery furnace is not that they worshiped God and were delivered from a fire. The point of the fiery furnace is that we worship God because of who He is, not because of what we get. You see, listen to how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego confront Nebuchadnezzar's demand to worship the statue. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, verse 16, replied to the king, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve, He is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us from your majesty's hand." But notice what they said there. He'll deliver us from you, even if it means we die. I mean, He could save us, but that's not the point. Verse 18, "But even if He does not, we want you to know, even if He does not rescue us, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." You see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying this: we do not worship God because of what we get. We worship God because of who He is. This isn't some parasitic relationship where we give Him something and He gives us something, but we are mutually dependent. No. Even if we die in the furnace, it does not change our allegiance. It does not change our worship. It does not change who we are and who we belong to. Because worship is war. But a lot of the times, you will cash in this key weapon in the battle simply because you don't get your way. Listen, God is not a cosmic Santa Claus in the sky, and that's something we Christians need to come to terms with. He is not some God in the sky that if you do good things, then you get put on the good list and then you get good stuff. That you get all the health that you could possibly want, or all the wealth. If this is your picture of God, don't be surprised that when you're in exile, you will not only be willing to compromise, but you will abandon you will reject him and choose instead to worship another deity, declaring allegiance to another. You see, one of the things that's fascinating is that when they come out of the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar's response tells us the point of this chapter. He says this, talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, they trusted in their God and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And that was very paradigm shifting for him. Because notice how his worship was centered on what he gave them or did not give them. He says, but there's something deeper here with these Jews and their God, because they worship him because of who he is, not because of what they get. You see, in the book of Daniel, worship is war. Because worship defines who you are. Or let me even say it a different way. Because when you worship, you become someone different. Or another way we could say it is that who you worship, you become. You take on their traits. You take on their characteristics. You take on their mannerisms. You take on the way in which they think and the way in which they talk. You start to look like them the same way that children look like their father. Because in a very real sense, worship isn't just something that you do. It's something that's done to you. Because true worship is transformational. True worship is life-altering. True worship confronts and upheaves everything that is not God. And the uncomfortable truth about this about this whole discussion is this. Who you trust is who you worship. And so here's my question to you. Hey, Christians, who do you trust? Who do you trust? Do you trust only the ones that give you things, that give you the good things that you ask for? Do you only trust the laws of the land? Do you only trust your bank accounts? Do you only trust politicians or your vote? My goodness. I dread every 4 years in the church election season. It's always one of those moments where the way that we talk about the candidates that we love, sometimes I wonder if we remember who we are, if we remember our greatest weapon in this battle. Because the way that we talk about the other side, especially if our side loses, is almost as if everything has crumbled. Several years ago, I did something really stupid. The day after the election for Obama's second term, I went on Facebook. Why would you do that? Here's a rule of thumb. Stay away from all social media anytime there's an election. Listen, I wasn't upset at people being upset. I was upset with what Christians were saying and what it said to me about their worship and who they trust. There was one particular friend that I had that she actually was my Sunday school teacher whenever I was young. She taught me about Jesus. And her post confused me. She said, last night, whenever I heard the results of the election, I began to weep. She said, in fact, I cried myself to sleep last night. And I never comment on social media, but I wanted to say, when was the last time that you cried yourself to sleep about orphans and widows in distress? When was the last time you cried yourself to sleep about those boys and girls caught in sex trafficking? When was the last time you cried yourself to sleep over the lost that don't know Jesus? Over an election? Who you worship, you trust. And so let me ask you again, who do you put your trust in? What do you put your trust in? Because in this world, worship is war. What we put our trust in is the way in which we fight, regardless of what happens, regardless if we get our way or we don't. Our worship never changes because we don't worship God for what we get. We worship God because of who He is. And the truth of the matter is this: worship is directly connected to identity because who you worship, you become, you begin to look like. In February of 2015, this militant group known as ISIS paraded 21 Egyptian Christians onto the banks of Libya. And they videoed the whole thing to send to the Western world that bowed their knees to Jesus. And in this moment, as they began chanting songs in worship of their God, one by one, each of the 21 Christians were beheaded. And it wasn't quick beheading. The image and the videos were deeply disturbing because it was a sawing. And it was in a different language, so it was hard to understand. But they came across two young men who, as they were cutting their heads off, they were screaming something out in their native tongue. On another video that I found, it was actually a radio station where a caller called in and said, "Those two men that you're talking about were my brothers, both of them. I had two brothers that were killed that day." They said, and what they were crying out was something that our family always repeats to ourselves, that Jesus is our Savior, Jesus is our King. Listen, sometimes the faithful are not saved from the furnace. And sometimes they are. But regardless of where you find yourself, you're still able to fight in the battle. Because the battle's not won. The battle is not measured based off of whether or not you live or you die. The battle is won based off of where you decide to put your trust. Because worship is war. Nebuchadnezzar knew that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that. My question for us today in the church is this: do we know that? That worship is war. And if it's true that who we worship, we become, we look like, then the body of Christ should continually look more like the crucified King. And it might be one of those moments where we take a long look in the mirror and ask ourselves the question, what do I look like? The God of Nebuchadnezzar or the God of the cross?